Welcome to Comp and Contribution, brought to you by Ludi. I'm Eric Leafgreen, VP of Physician Compensation here at Ludi. We're joined here with a very special guest. We have Joni from Kassouf CPA and Advisors. Joni, could you say hello to everyone out there and give us a little brief background on what you do at Kassouf?
Absolutely. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me, Eric. So I'm Joni Wyatt. I'm a director in healthcare advisory services at Kassouf Company. And as you mentioned, we are a CPA firm, but my team are actually the healthcare advisors. So we all come from the healthcare delivery system, various healthcare delivery systems, so hospitals, clinics, that sort of thing. And we focus primarily on provider physician operations, revenue cycle, compensation. My work is primarily in physician compensation and looking at all of the various regulatory changes and how that impacts compensation on our physician side. So don't do taxes, which I very much appreciate, but I am in a CPA firm that primarily focuses on healthcare.
That's fantastic. That kind of has a special place in my heart for me. I joined a CPA firm right out of college and worked there for a while, but I was kind of told that I shouldn't be doing taxes. So I did the next best thing and did physician compensation. Let's go ahead and dive into today's topic, the Medicare physician fee schedule. Every year, there's always changes to the fee schedule. What were some of the big changes to the fee schedule this year for 26?
Yeah. There was a period of time where the fee schedule would come out. We'd wait for the conversion factor. We'd wait for some minor changes. And then somewhere around 2020, CMS made these massive changes to the fee schedule that shook up everything. This year is kind of the next time you really see a big change in that the fee schedule is now split in two. This was statutorily required under MACRA. So, essentially, if you are a provider in a qualified APM program, then your fee schedule, then the Medicare conversion factor is going to go up 0.75%, as opposed to if you're a non-qualified provider in a APM, then it'll only go up 0.25%. So we think that'd be easy enough to calculate. We know what last year's conversion factor was. We know how to add 0.75 and 0.25, but it's not that simple. So the big change was the fact that we've split that into two separate conversion factors based on the status of a provider, but also other adjustments that are associated with that we don't typically see. So in the Medicare physician fee schedule, it identifies that there, in addition to the increase of 0.75 or 0.25, depending on where you sit in that status of alternative payment model, there's also going to be a budget neutrality increase of 0.49%. So on top of the increase associated with the statutory requirements, there's a 0.49% increase on top of that. And then another statutory increase of 2.5%. That's a one-time adjustment. And all of those things together are actually going to create an environment where we have a fee schedule that's gone from a little over $32, $32.35 to now $33.57 if you are in the APM, qualified participant in the APM, and $33.40 if you're a non-qualified participant in the APM, which means that depending on where you sit, your rate of pay from CMS is going to be different for the exact same services. The other big change, I think, that we see, because the government giveth and then the government taketh away, is the efficiency adjustment that has been applied for the first time. We can talk a little bit more about that in detail, but the efficiency adjustment is a negative adjustment that will impact overall compensation through the work RVU mechanism. It doesn't impact the conversion factor, so to speak, but it does, in fact, impact the overall reimbursement associated with physician compensation and just reimbursement for practice work.
That's really interesting. It sounds like a pretty big fundamental shift in how CMS is operating. I hear the bifurcation of the conversion factor. I also hear this efficiency adjustment. So, if my understanding historically, CMS has worked with the RUC committee, and they've really done a lot of work around what is the value of the work RVUs for the physician and clinician services. And they do some methodologies to there. Sounds like CMS has kind of said, hey, over a period of time, technology and operation statuses have made this more efficient for these procedures. And the process to account for that through the normal RUC committee process hasn't accounted for that. And so we're going to make that adjustment. Can you walk through how do they determine this 2.5% adjustment? What were their internal benchmarks and calculations to do that?
Yeah. So just like, just like there's various components of a total RVU, the work RVU itself has three separate components. So it has the pre-work, the intra-service, and then the post-service. The efficiency adjustment actually is only going to apply to the intra-service. And so that efficiency adjustment is only going to be a 2.5% reduction of that portion of the work RVU, not the total work RVU. Outside of that, it also excludes some codes. So like E&M codes, telehealth codes, time-based codes, they won't have the adjustment. Those codes will not have the adjustment. But still, roughly about 9,000 codes are going to be effective, right under 9,000 of the 12,000 codes that are out there. So the majority still will be. When the RUC identifies or when they make recommendations around the MEI, which is the Medicare Economic Index, all that is basically an indicator of inflation. So how much do things cost? How has cost changed? That's going to be overhead. That's going to be compensation associated with physician practice services. Over the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, every year there's an adjustment. And I think you mentioned that adjustment is what then drives changes in the physician fee schedule. Since the RUC historically has only looked at revaluing or done an analysis of a handful of codes every year, they absolutely think that the productivity has been overstated. So essentially, they've just given too much value. And so that efficiency adjustment is essentially just the culmination or the aggregated total of the last 5 years of MEI adjustment. So the MEI increase over the last 5 years equated to 2.5%. And so the 2.5% adjustment is negative to offset that. And it's only applicable to the intra-service portion of the work RVU.
Oh, that's very interesting. I love the breakdown of that. That's really helpful. Now, this was applied to this year's fee schedule. Is this adjustment something that's going to be going forward? Was it a one-time adjustment? Or is it something that's going to be more periodic, that they have a schedule and routine that they're going to do this on a routine basis going forward?
So this year it was based on a 5-year historical, and then going forward, they're going to look at the adjustment based on every 3 years. And so now we all know that congressional intervention, statutory change, party change, administration change, all those things can change what'll happen with what'll be the adjustment going forward. But as of right now, it's actually set to be looked at every 3 years. The one thing I will say that all of our politicians do agree on is that Medicare is expensive. And so when it comes to things like reducing or adjusting cost or making costs more appropriate, we typically don't see a lot of argument around that. Everyone sort of agrees. So I tend to think that 3-year evaluation and then potential adjustment change is actually going to remain in place. So I think the efficiency adjustment is here to stay. I think it's going to occur every so many years. But then again, technology and, you talked about, improvement in overall efficiencies. They could at some point determine that 3 years is too long and they could do it annually. But that's where we are right now. Every 3 years is what we're expecting.
When I read this, I just think it's a really big fundamental change in how we approach building the work RVUs for the Medicare physician fee schedule. The scope of the impact sounds pretty large, right? We're talking about 9,000 plus codes.
Mhm.
That's a lot of codes and a lot of procedures. When we think about what is the impact to medical groups and physicians and other clinicians, who's going to be impacted? What's the profile of that clinician? Is it by specialty and maybe a combination of how they practice, what their procedural mix is? Maybe is there like a specialty area that jumps out to you, like primary care, medical specialty, hospital-based procedures kind of jump out to me a little bit when I hear this. Is there an area that you think is going to be disproportionately impacted by this change?
Yeah, I mean, and I think thankfully primary care is likely going to be fairly safe because E&M codes are exempt, so they're not going to have the adjustment. Our surgical specialist, particular things that are long, effort intensive, or typically effort intensive that have a high intra-service quantifier, those are going to be impacted the most. So I think right now the two specialties that are sticking out the most are invasive interventional cardiology and neurosurgery. So again, two specialties that have very intense procedures that overall will see big impacts in the reduction for a specific service. The flip side to that, and there's been a lot of analysis about this because everyone's looking at which procedures have the highest intra-service numbers. So where are those going to get cut the most? But what's not really been focused on, except in a couple of places, has been the high volume areas where maybe the total work RVU is not really high, but the intra-service portion of the total work RVU is large. So I think endotracheal intubation is high volume. It does not have a very high work RVU, but the portion of inner service, the inner service portion of that work RVU is significant. So you've got a lot of volume, and you've got a big part of that service that actually is going to be hit with the 2.5%. So whether it's high inner service value with low volume, or high volume with maybe a lower total value but a higher portion, those are our places where we're really going to be looking. So right now, everyone is still worried about cardiology or interventional cardiology and neurosurgery, but I think we're going to see some of those higher volume procedures in areas start to feel the impact probably equally so as the specialties are.
That's good information there. I think about folks that are kind of E&M based, they're probably insulated. Folks that do more time-based procedures as a portion of their work are protected. Folks at high utilization of certain codes, especially when you look at the intra piece there. What about those that operate underneath a team-based model? Maybe they're a little bit leveraged where they have a physician and an APP doing some of the work, or they work in a team-based care model. Do you think this will drive change in that area or impact folks that are leveraged from that perspective?
Well, so the efficiency adjustment is going to impact your work RVU calculation. So we will see a small reduction in work RVU calculation, but because you really have, everyone's work RVUs are the same value. The only difference is that in a scenario where you have a mid-level, those work RVUs are often adjusted by a certain percent negatively, unless it's actually billed under the provider in an incident 2 type situation. So I'm not sure that it's going to have any different impact based on whether it's a mid-level or a regular provider, because the percent adjustment is going to be the same. It's just going to be on a different whole number. So whether that's the total 100% fee schedule or 85% of the fee schedule, if it's a 2% reduction for that particular service, then it's still going to be a 2% reduction for that additional service. I think that there may be some variations on services or combinations of services that have typically been performed for certain diagnoses and certain disease states, but I'm not sure that it's actually going to make any change as to who provides that service.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I'll just kind of just kind of random thought that jumped in my head when I was thinking about there's opportunity to push services to one area or another area. Still have to kind of focus on quality and operations there. We talked about the conversion factor, how that's changed, the efficiency adjustment. Those certainly made the headlines. Were there any other changes to the fee schedule that jumped out to you that maybe didn't get the attention of operators and consultants in the world?
Yeah, I think the practice expense adjustment is something that we're seeing. Historically, the physician or the work portion of the fee schedule actually had two different fees depending on the location of service. So if a provider was providing a service in a hospital under a hospital tax ID, then it was based on a facility fee schedule for the professional service. If it's done in a clinic, a non-facility, then it would actually be a separate fee schedule. Well, the practice expense is being looked at in the same way. I mean, typically that was one expense number or one expense value by service, regardless of where it was actually being performed. Now we're going to see a similar thing where there's actually going to be a different expense portion or a different expense rate of the total RVU based on that location of service, whether it's a facility location or an outpatient location. There's been a lot of, with this particular release or this particular final rule, there's been a lot of pushback around some of the lack of transparency about all these adjustments. So I know the AMA has made a couple of comments. I know MGMA, some of the other organizations have basically said, we understand the methodology, but there seems to be some lack of transparency about how you're going to get there. And I think that the PE portion, the practice expense portion, is one of those areas where we're not really sure how that's going to impact individual practices because we've never had it. We've never really had it adjusted that way. And like, all of these things are so nuanced depending on your practice patterns, your specialty, because it's all CPT code level. So one doctor who's of the same specialty, but maybe practices a little different than another provider of the same specialty, could see a difference in what the impact is, whether that be through the efficiency adjustment or even through the practice expense change that we just talked about.
Yeah, when I hear this, I think about what is the impact from an organizational perspective, right? You have changes to your reimbursement and revenue. Now you also have changes to your clinical compensation models if you pay a lot of providers on the work RVU model. And that can impact your net income. And healthcare operations are generally pretty low margin areas. And having these changes year to year can just be very disruptive to your operating strategy. Are there specialties when you think just maybe from a reimbursement standpoint are going to be more impacted than other areas if you're maybe heavy in a single specialty medical practice, or maybe have a couple more providers in that specialty that compared to other specialties?
What's bad is that the overall reduction is actually like 19% for across the codes that are actually being reduced. But let me look at which specialties we're going to get hit the hardest. So right now we're anticipating that the largest reductions are going to be in infectious disease and neurosurgery. Gastroenterology is also predicted to have some pretty negative impacts. I think that that's a combination, though, of multiple things. And it's kind of what I mentioned a minute ago. You've got a adjustment to the conversion factor, which, depending on who you are or what type of provider you are and what programs you participate in, will determine what your conversion factor is for your fees. Simultaneously, you have another adjustment and potentially two adjustments that is impacting the value associated or the multiplier against those fees. And so it is really nuanced. Again, when I say it looks like neurosurgery is going to be impacted, well, we think that's probably because of the efficiency adjustment. You may see some other impacts for gastroenterology or some of the other specialties, but that could be primarily based on something not related to the adjustments we were just talking about. Because at the same time that we have these new adjustments, the practice expense adjustment, the efficiency adjustment, there are the regular adjustments that happen every year, where I often say it's kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul, where essentially money is moved around to better represent the cost of services, the value of physician work associated with it, but all under the guise that it has to stay budget neutral under the Medicare fee schedule, which is a requirement. So I guess to answer your question, those are the specialties that are predicted to have the most impact. But to what degree is always a big question mark to me. I think analysis has to be much more detailed if you really want to know how it's going to impact your individual practice or your individual hospital. Because if you've got an increase in your conversion factor, which means you might be making more revenue, which is fantastic. But simultaneously, you might be paying out more in work RVUs. Or conversely, you have this increase in your conversion factor, but your work RVU adjustment's gone down. You might be paying out less, which might be a benefit if you're an employer, but not a benefit if you're the employee. So the analysis has to be at a much more granular level to really determine how it's going to impact you. I think it would be short-sighted of a hospital or even a provider to say, I'm a neurosurgeon, therefore I expect I'll be hit by 2%. Probably worth looking at if you're on the negative side of the adjustment predictions, but it doesn't mean it's going to be 2%. It means it could be somewhere in the negative, but may not impact you as much as you think, or even more than what's projected.
Yeah, that's really good. I think you brought up a couple of good points here. One is like it depends where you sit and what the impact is. And, organizationally, is my revenue going to go up or down? Is my labor expense going to go up or down? And how does that impact my net income or net loss from my physician enterprise? But I also think about it, if I'm a physician and you come to me and say, hey, we're going to update the fee schedule. If you do the same work that you did last year, you're going to make less money. And I think some physicians, rightfully so, would be like, hey, if I do the same thing I did last year, why am I going to earn less money? And so you have some friction among your labor workforce there that you have to kind of navigate.
Mm-hmm.
But you really hit the nail there when you talked about making sure you do the analysis. Can you maybe walk through what your approach is on doing this analysis? And maybe some planning tips that you could do, like from an activity schedule, if you're building a calendar out, when do you want to start putting checkpoints in and what activities do you want to do throughout the year?
Yeah. Hopefully all of our providers and hospitals are doing an actual analysis on revenue change or revenue impact every year, because we know every year the conversion factor changes, the fee schedules change. And even though we're talking about Medicare, that really does sort of trickle down to our other payers because it's market based. So hopefully they're doing that. At the same time, though, it is also a comparison on how much is my revenue going up or down compared to, like you said, how much am I paying out more or less based on the change on the work RVU. We had this happen. I mentioned the 2020 to 2021 massive change where, if you remember, prior to 2021, our conversion factor was actually over $36. Everyone forgets that because it seems like it was so far long ago. And of course, we're sitting at 32.35, or actually 33 this year, but it was 32.35 last year. So we've had this huge reduction. But back then, what happened is there was a huge increase in the work RVU value. So the opposite of what you said happened. The physicians came and said, oh, I'm going to make all this more money because my work RVUs are valued so much higher. But at the same time, the value of those work RVUs actually went down, specifically from $36 to about $34 at that point. We have a little bit of the opposite happening this year, although not as extreme. But while the work RVU values are going down, the actual conversion factors went up. So you have to weigh both sides. You have to see what the impact is on the revenue side, and then what's the impact on the payout side, on the compensation side, to see, am I still paying my providers what we intend to pay them? I use the term intended compensation a lot because we do get kind of caught up on conversion factors and thresholds and work RVU values. But in the end, there isn't, in fact, a market value for a particular service. And so what we're really doing is trying to make sure we're looking at how the revenue changes and how the value of the work changes, so that regardless of what the model looks like, you end up back at intended compensation. And if you don't, then at that point, there needs to be a potential shift or adjustment to your compensation models. Because in one scenario, the physician's making too much compared to what's being reimbursed. And in the other scenario, they're making too little compared to what's being reimbursed. So I hope that answers your question. It really is both sides of the coin having to be compared, the revenue as well as the value of the work.
I really like the word intended compensation there. I think that helps frame the discussion when you're talking about these nuanced changes here. I kind of observed too, I was working at a health system in 2020 and we had to handle this massive change, and it was kind of a new experience for us, that level of change. Do you think, where should this type of analysis be done? Like, who should have oversight of it? I think obviously the revenue teams and the RCMs should be owners on the reimbursement side. But I think from a provider and physician compensation perspective, is this something from the compensation committee? Because I hear a lot of required skill sets, right? We need someone that really knows the physician fee schedule. We need some folks that know revenue cycle and billing and coding. We need some regulatory compliance folks, and we need people that understand physician comp models. So, where do you think this type of analysis should be done at? Is it the provider comp committee, or does it sit somewhere else in the organization?
No, I think you're right. I think it's going to have to be a group effort. Even if the analysis itself is done even by a third party, we do these analysis, but if it's done by a third party, the people in the room have to represent all the parts that I just discussed. So somebody has to say, how is this change in revenue going to impact our bottom line and our budget? And at the same time, the person who calculates the physician compensation and is responsible for determining, are we still meeting intended comp for the services or the value of the services that we've identified for these providers, has to also have a seat at the table so that they know how that impacts the total bottom line, whether that's going up or down. The compliance people always should be there, only because they're the ones who are basically saying, based on what you revenue people are saying you're going to make less or more of, this is how much we have to adjust the physician comp side to make sure that we're not out of compliance. So it's going to need, even if the actual analysis and the numbers are put together by a third party, all of the players that I just discussed really needed to be at the table to determine what the best course of action is and whether or not contracts or models have to be adjusted ultimately to get back to that intended comp.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some of these type of analysis, you need to have the bandwidth and capacity to do internally and have the technical know-how to do it. If you don't have the bandwidth or the technical know-how, certainly needs to be outsourced, but the decision can't be. That's still a management decision.
That's right.
But folks need to be a part of it. I think about kind of independence. I can still remember my CPA requirements there, but I think about that element. It's a good point. What kind of tools do you need? Obviously it's labor intensive and it's specialized labor. Are there tools that can help you do this in a more efficient way or help navigate these complex problems?
Back in the day, we did everything in Excel. And it was labor intensive and awful. I did it myself because I worked at a health system, and we would calculate kind of the variance in work RVUs and productivity. And then we compare that to the numbers that were given to us or the projected numbers given to us by the finance department. This has become so much more complex, and there are lots of additional everyday adjustments associated with physician comp. So just because even if we know that a particular service is going to be reimbursed at X amount, and it's going to be reimbursed at X amount with the adjustments we talked about, with the efficiency adjustment, with the provider location adjustment, all of those things, even within that context, there's additional adjustments up or down that can occur to revenue based on the context of the service. Was that service done in a surgical environment where it was done with lots of other procedures? Will there be additional cuts to that revenue because of multiple services? Is it in a context where they would actually have an increase in revenue based on some kind of modifier or context of service? In those situations, I think the Excel spreadsheet falls apart because it is in a very, very labor intensive. If there's the ability to use any kind of technology to do that, I think that's the way to do it. It allows you then to not only project what that actual reimbursement change is, but it simultaneously identify how that's going to impact compensation. So those two numbers that we talked about, comparing the revenue number and then the productivity value number, you can get to those at the same time with the same adjustments applied, which is key. Because otherwise, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges. You're saying, we anticipate this change in revenue, but you're not considering all the same adjustments when you're looking at the work RVU. And you need to do both, or else the productivity to compensation ratio gets really out of whack. And I think that's important to keep that compensation should always be following productivity. And when that variance gets too wide, then we start having a compliance issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just a couple more questions here. One is, how often do you think you should be changing your fee schedule for compensation purposes? I'm sure if I get 10 accountants in the room or 10 consultants in the room, I'd probably get 15 different opinions. Mm-hmm. So it'd be kind of interesting to see kind of what is your perspective and advice for folks out there. How often should you make changes? And then kind of coupled with that, what about contract language? I think about, should your contract be restrictive and very prescriptive on it, saying every year we're going to do it? Or is it a little bit more flexible and ambiguous, or maybe it's just completely silent? I don't know. What is the right answer on that? I'm not an attorney, so obviously this is not legal advice or anything like that, but I find it interesting on how to approach that.
So every year we should be doing analysis on the fee schedule and how it impacts revenue. And every year tables that associate that revenue with the value of the work RVU really should be updated. So it goes back to what I said, since compensation really needs to follow productivity. If we are moving down a path where we're getting reimbursed based on one set of rules from 2026, but our work RVUs are still being calculated based on 2024, then we now have a mismatch, because those numbers were put in place and those adjustments were put in place to balance based on the same year. So that really should be done every year. Now, that doesn't mean you renegotiate a contract every year. I think that would be quite the administrative burden to have to do that. But your language should be such that you're following some kind of methodology. So I use the word methodology a lot because I don't want to have to recalculate everything every year or reset every year. But the contract should say that we're going to follow the most current values of, CMS values of work RVUs. We're going to adjust things in the same context as CMS would, make those changes as they would. And then even more importantly, make some kind of language or exception that if there is a drastic change to CMS's methodology, that at that point, even if you're mid-contract, that either party can come forward with the desire to relook at the model, the comp model. If you think about the big change that happened in 2020 to 2021, and maybe even this year because of the bifurcation of the conversion factors, all of a sudden we had a lot of providers who were no longer paid their intended compensation. And there was no language in those contracts that said, if CMS decides to go hugely away from where they've gone, they take a completely different path from what they've done in the past, then we need to relook at this, because in the end, that is now not really considered. It's like changing the rules mid-course. So if they change the rules, essentially you have the right to go and look at the comp model. And both parties should be able to do that, because it can be adjusted up or it can be adjusted down. So simplifying the answer to you, I think the actual tables and the fee schedule should be updated every year, but not necessarily the contract. The contract can be looked at, in 3-year terms, but have the ability to be adjusted or looked at based on the rule changes that CMS puts in place if it significantly impacts overall intended comp up or down, and certainly if it becomes non-compliant.
That's good advice. So if I hear you right, every year we need to do an analysis from reimbursement, your clinical and physician workforce, and how it impacts compensation. How we deploy that changes year to year. Our contracts need to reflect the methodology and the approach that we have, but have some outs in it that if there's drastic changes, we can raise our hand and have a conversation about it and get some resolution. But if it's just minor changes, we can navigate through that. I know I oversimplified it from that perspective, but I think that's good advice for folks to think about this and putting this into their workflow. I don't think a lot of provider comp teams or physician comp teams or committees have this as an agenda item and a standalone workflow within their group, where they budget for it from hey, we need to spend some dedicated resources to managing this in December every year and walking through it.
And it is time consuming. So, monitoring it all throughout the year. So how is productivity going up or down? Being on top of what we anticipate the changes to be for the next year, because we get a proposed rule in the middle of the year, so we can start planning for some of those things, helps us stay ahead of where we need to focus. If you are following that methodology we talked about, if we're following a methodology that says if there's over 1% variance in either one or the other, then we're allowed to renegotiate, or then we're going to approach renegotiation. Then at that point, language like that helps you from having to look at all of it. It's still an analysis, but if you're monitoring it throughout the year, you sort of get the red flag on certain contracts or certain specialties, or in certain situations where you say this one needs to be addressed this year and the other ones maybe not. So it's not really a sit down and look at every contract every year. It may be we're really just monitoring the contract all year to identify which ones need to be targeted at the end of the year for adjustment.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your time here today. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with anyone out there?
I think my only thought with all of this is that what I've learned is that I can have all of this information and it comes to me in, nice little succinct bullet points from CMS and listservs and all of these things. And we think we know it. And at any given moment, they can send out something that says we changed our mind and we're doing it a different way. And so just because you think you know it today and you know how this is being calculated today or the rules today, doesn't mean that tomorrow that's going to change. We've had some short-term fixes on several things related to the Medicare physician fee schedule. Those expire, and then they may be delayed, an expiration may be delayed, or there may be a complete change to the original methodology or the original adjustment. So it's not a one and done, we got our Medicare fee schedule, pat on the back, now we know what we're dealing with. You still have to be diligent because Medicare likes to change things, and they don't necessarily follow their own timeline.
Well, excellent. I know I appreciate your insights. I definitely learned some information today. I hope folks out there learned some information as well. One last question. If you weren't working at a CPA firm, an expert in everything Medicare physician fee schedule, what would you be doing?
Oh gosh, like a professionally, as like in my same profession, or if I really had whatever job I ever wanted to do.
Any job that you ever wanted to do.
Okay, so I was convinced that if I had any job I ever wanted to do, that I would be a gardener at Epcot Center in Disney World. And because the plants and the topiaries there are so beautiful, and I love gardening, and I said, that's what I would do for my job. I think that would bring me great happiness. And there's very little stress when all you're doing is dealing with flowers and beautiful plants all day.
That sounds fantastic. There's certainly no stress at the Mouse's house down in Orlando. I guess
Yes.
it's a peaceful
Yes.
place. So, well, thank you for joining us today. I think that concludes our time, and thank you.
All right. Thank you.